The HBO show Euphoria is one of the biggest shows in the cultural lexicon right now, but it's starting to come under some fire, specifically for its depiction of addiction.
I'm JT. I'm in my mid-30s, have a 10-year media career, and nearly a decade of sobriety. So how did another middle-class kid turn into a blackout drunk and a heroin junkie? More importantly, how did it change, and where do we go from here? This is my story.
So to start things off, I'm going to reference an article that came out this week from the publication Vox. And the article really sums up what the criticisms of Euphoria are out there right now. They're specifically linked to a recent episode in the second season of the show. The headline of the piece, which I will link below, is really about the criticisms that are out there in the public in social media. It starts out talking about how it's being criticized for its depiction of black addiction. Obviously, I have no experience with the black experience, but as you know, I do have a lot of experience with addiction, and I have some thoughts on how it's portrayed on screen in general, and specifically with this show. So let's just go through some of the more broad criticisms that are out there right now. That the show in general is beyond hyper-realistic, that it's totally unrealistic for how high schoolers should be depicted and how addiction, sex, and the like should be depicted realistically in a high school setting. And that addiction is not depicted correctly for a young person, for a teenager, and how the family reacts to addiction. So I'm just going to give my general thoughts on the show. And I'll just tell you that when this show came out for its first season a couple years ago, I thought it was fantastic. I recommended it to all my friends. In fact, one of my best friends, one of my friends that is like my go-to guy for anything culturally, music, movies, comic books, anything, he actually reached out to me recently because there was such a lag between season 1 and season 2 of Euphoria. And he said, hey, thank you so much for recommending that show 2 years ago. I love it. And he's not necessarily a guy that would love it for the same reasons that I would. I think he really likes it for the artistic tone of the show. The thing I responded to immediately was, I thought it was the closest thing that had ever been depicted to my actual high school experience. And this is so interesting, and I think it really informs how different all of our experiences are, even if we grow up in the same area, because I know so many people who have watched this show and gone, yeah, I mean, I guess you could freak out about that, but no one has anything to worry about because no high schoolers act like that. Meanwhile, I'm going, this is my high school experience. Sure, there's plenty of things that are like beyond dramatically heightened, but high school was like this in a lot of respects for me. There was addiction going on, drug use, alcohol use in extreme ways. Obviously, you've heard just some of my stories. You know that I became a heroin addict in my 20s and had to get sober at 25, and I had more or less a pretty general, pretty basic middle-class upbringing. So high school, it just stands to reason, would have something to do with that, right? All of that was going on at my high school. The sexual stuff, a lot of it was going on at my high school. People having relations with kids, having relationships with adults was part of my high school experience. Just to the T, some things. And I never even thought that it would be depicted on television because, number one, a lot of people don't want to see that. Number two, I thought I grew up in a Twilight Zone, so how would that ever be represented? I thought my experience was so unique, and I kind of honestly thought that because, I was so kind of messed up in the head when I was in high school, that maybe I was just seeing it through a lens, or I was experiencing the darkest possible side of my high school experience. It turns out that this is actually what happens in a lot of people's high school experience. So that's my biggest takeaway. Now, when it comes to depicting addiction in this show, and in a broader sense, depicting addiction and alcoholism in movies and television, I'm going to use a little anecdote. My mother loved Law and Order. She loved all the different versions of it, and she watched it all the time, and I watched it with her a lot. Well, my mom was a public officer of the law. She was a prosecutor starting out in the Dallas DA's office. When I was in high school, when she went back to work, she was a prosecutor in Collin County. So she lived the experience of one of the most popular TV shows of all time. And if she were to pick apart everything that was unrealistic about the show, because she actually went through it, she would never watch the show. And no one would want to watch it with her because she'd just be picking it apart bit by bit. She didn't do that because she actually enjoyed the show, and she could let it flow and enjoy it without digging into all the things that were not accurate about it, because obviously it's made for television, it's made for entertainment, and she could appreciate what was inspired by or close enough that she enjoyed it. So I kind of watch the same way when movies and TV shows depict addiction. They don't always get everything right. It's a really hard thing. Alcoholics Anonymous, like 12-step programs. You've seen a lot of meetings. They show meetings, people going to meetings in TV and movies. It's a very hard thing to depict on screen. It's really hard to get the actual tone. And you got to remember, a lot of the people who are making these things have not actually experienced it on the level that someone like me has. Do I think that it should be a requirement? Absolutely not, because that's not entertainment. Think of how many great actors, think of how many great roles Daniel Day-Lewis had where he embodied the character and tried to put himself into that character's life in every aspect. Well, I don't know if Daniel Day-Lewis has ever portrayed a drug addict, but I don't know if even he would go as far as to like become addicted to heroin. I know Ewan McGregor talked about that when he did one of my favorite movies and favorite addiction movies, Trainspotting, and he didn't go through with it because, well, that's kind of crazy, right? You shouldn't have to go through that. And I'm also an actor, or I was an actor. And so I do believe that you don't have to, as a creative person, as a person who's in a creative medium in my career, I don't think that you have to experience those things to be able to depict them. I think that's what's great about art and what's great about creativity. I think you should study them and you should get as close as you possibly can. And I think most do, because people who are creating things on this high of a scale, I believe for the most part, they're really passionate about it and they really want to do the best job possible. And they want to honor people's experiences like mine when they put it on screen. All that being said, my point is, I don't sit and pick apart how close something is to a real life addiction or a real life 12-step meeting or a real life interaction with a sponsor, because I just like to enjoy things on their merits. But the caveat to that that's specific to addiction is addiction may be the most personal experience anyone could go through. And because of that, it is so different and unique for every person who's experiencing it and every family who's experiencing it, that within reason, just about every depiction I've ever seen offered of alcoholism and addiction on screen, I accept. Because the details, I talk about with my story that I'm not special, right? I'm not unique because we're all really coming from the same place. And that's true. But the details, the little details are always different. And we can always see something that we relate to that's true or something that's different and we relate to the spirit of that. But everyone's experience is so different and so unique to them that I don't think it's fair to say that there's only one way or there's a box that this show has to perform inside of in order to be accurate. Everyone's experience is so, and some of the criticism is how the parents are handled in this show. And that's one of the things, to be quite honest with you, I relate to the most about this show, because I had, and a lot of my friends had, parents who were disconnected from our struggles, either just because that's the way they were or because they just didn't know how to handle it. And my parents and my friends' parents who were going through similar things tried every different thing in the book. And I think the show does represent the gamut of different tacks, different emotional cues that a family can go through experiencing addiction. So again, I have nothing to say about the depiction of the Black experience because I am obviously white and I don't have any lived experience with that. But if we can single out that this show is primarily about an addict and an addict's experience in a high school, and none of us get to choose where we grow up. None of us get to choose what school system we go through. None of us get to choose the world that revolves around us when we're at our most trying times as an adolescent. And I really relate to, there's a lot of this hubbub has come up over a recent episode where the main character, Rue, has this huge blow up and fit where she's throwing stuff and breaking stuff and throwing bows. And I'll tell you right now, like as dramatic as that may seem, and I think there were some criticisms that it was way too over the top. Why? Being a teenager is the most dramatic, over the top time of your life. It certainly was for me because that's all I knew. I thought that everything that was going on in my world at that time was all that was ever going to go on in my world. So everything was the end of the world. I had that moment. You can stop my sister or my dad at the middle of the street and they would tell you that my house got torn to shreds more than one occasion, how many different holes, how many different times my parents had to decide whether they were going to call the police on me or not. I find it very accurate. And I find the indecision, the not knowing how to handle it of the parent in the situation as accurate as well. So those are kind of my key points. I think it's a fantastic show. I highly recommend it. It is not for everyone. It is it is almost X-rated. But I do think it's important to know that this stuff is really going on in high schools across our country, and that kids, really children, are dealing with things with a child's developed emotions and a child's developed brain, but very adult situations. And I think that's the biggest thing, that juxtaposition. That's what I really connect to in this show, was that I didn't know it at the time, but I was so undeveloped emotionally and mentally, and I was forced into these, what turned out to be very adult situations. Now, I wasn't smart enough, I wasn't developed enough to know that I was actually seeking those out, which was part of the problem. And if I hadn't been seeking them out, if I hadn't had so much trouble at home and not having peace in my life and my family life, I maybe wouldn't have been seeking those things out. If I had a better understanding of how much it was going to screw me up more, then I maybe wouldn't have been seeking those things out. But when you're a teenager, first of all, again, not thinking everything through, not capable of thinking everything through. That's why we have guardians until we're 18. And I just think that it is very realistic, and I think it's good for people to see, not only for the depiction of the addiction, and maybe that's something we can do on this channel sometime, is I can kind of recommend some of my more favorite depictions of alcoholism and addiction in media for you to go out and watch and then comment on. Let me know what you think. But I think Euphoria is a great one. And more than anything, I just think it's a very well-made show. I think it's creative as shit and just comes up with the most out-of-the-box type ways of tackling certain things. But most importantly, I really connect with it because I really connect with this character, Rue. I don't have the lived experience of a mixed-race teenage girl, but I have the lived experience of a teenager who has experienced really dramatic mental health issues and drug addiction at an early age and having to grow up in a world that they did not choose. I really connect with that. And I, quite frankly, don't think that connection needs to have anything to do with more than the internal connection. I think that's really all there is to it. So recommend watching the show. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're watching this and you're an addict, you have an experience with an addict, if you think Euphoria is or isn't an accurate depiction. I think it's just fine. I think we could nick away at the ways that it, might be a little inaccurate or a little too heightened or dramatic. But like I said, it's the closest I've ever seen to the experience I had as a teenager growing up. Okay, let's get the mail. Mail today in response to last week's video about my experience with love and sex addiction comes from Facebook. This comes from our friend Scott. And Scott says, sex is the easy part, too often used as the default in a relationship. You're on the money. Scott, thank you so much for your comment. Thank you for your compliment. I will say that for me, your first line, sex is the easy part, I totally understand what you're saying. What you're saying is, that's the easy part because the real hard part is the relationship, right? It's the stuff outside of that. It's coexisting. It's managing emotions. It's managing a family and finances and and years and years and decades in a relationship. For me, though, I think sex was not the easy part, which is case in point of why, I spilled the beans on all that stuff in that video, why I can't engage with it in kind of the way that someone my age, my sort of social situation might typically engage with it. I just can't because it's not easy for me. It causes complications for me. So I totally take in what you're saying, and it's absolutely true. I would say the difference for me is, I think that for me, it is easier to deal with the actually talking about my feelings and getting through stuff with someone else. I have actually experienced, and this is just my experience and the people that I've been with, that part is hard because I have not so far really been in relationships with people who were ready to engage on that level, which I think is kind of crazy because I feel like I'm kind of late in the game. I'm 35, I'm going to be 36 this year, and I've been in some serious long-term relationships. You think about a lot of people my age have been married for a decade and have kids who are going into junior high. And the people who are around my age that I've had serious relationships with over the past 10 years did not really, when it came down to it, want to engage and talk through things as much as I did. Now, I may be a unique case in that. In my family, we talked everything out. Some things that, talk is in quotes, right? A lot of it was yelling everything out. But we talked about our feelings in my family, maybe too much. So I've always been comfortable talking about my feelings, and I think it is therapeutic. Obviously, I have a lot more experience with therapy this far into my life than a lot of other people my age. But I would say that has been the complication with the stuff outside of sex for me in relationships, is that the person I've been in a relationship with hasn't really wanted to talk about their feelings as much as I am willing to, and hasn't really been willing to talk out situations. I'm one of those people, sure, I'm sensitive. Something's is good, you say can hurt me for sure, but I'd much rather talk through it and live with the results of the conversation and figure out where to go next than to not know. And for that to be something that my partner is carrying, that scares the crap out of me. And I will say that because of this, I'll tell you, I am seeking out, for the first time in my life, I have kind of bullet points. I kind of know what I'm looking for. That was never the case. The long-term serious relationships that I've been in, I just kind of fell into. I didn't know what I wanted out of a relationship. And now I know that is something that's important to me. That's high up on that bullet list, is being willing to talk about how they're feeling, how we're doing, and me being willing to listen. That's really important to me, and hopefully I'll find it. But thank you so much for your comments, Scott. If you would like to be part of the mail, of course you can comment on this video on YouTube or any other video on the channel. I am seeing all the comments as they come. Even still, we're a pretty small operation right now, so I see everything. Or you can comment when I post on any of the following social media handles: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, like Scott did this week. You can send me a private message if you'd like to, and that will not come here unless I ask first. All right, that's all we got for this week. We'll see you next time. Hey family, if you like what we're doing here and you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Share it with someone who you think might benefit from watching this, and feel free to comment below. Love.